In case a Kia EV9 is a bit too much for you in terms of lifestyle and budget, Kia also offers this EV3, which is basically a shrunken EV9 in every dimension, but still with a very recognizable family face. My name is Peter, and in this video we're going to have a look around this EV3 and see what it has to offer. And I think starting on the front, it is very recognizable Kia EV line. And the main thing obviously is these daytime running light patterns that are supposed to represent a star sign, something that you really have to want to see in terms of, what it should be, but okay. I quite like it. It looks nice, especially also with this vertical main beams next to it. It's nice. It's a very own family face. And overall the look here from the front is nice. It's clean, it's boxy, it's modern, it's a little bit futuristic as well. I quite like it. This mint green color, by the way, not really for me. They also have more like a baby blue color. That's much more like it, but unfortunately this was the only one available as press demo. So we're going to do with this one today. Now the good news continues here on the front, because something that Volkswagen, for example, is unable to do with its ID models, we have a frunk. Little compartment here for some extra stuff. Now don't get too excited, it's about the size of a big shoebox, so it's nothing crazy, but it's a nice clean solution, because it's always handy to have some extra space here, whether it's for your vehicle to load charger, you can stuff your full cable in there if you really want to. It's just handy to have that, and it's also a bit more elegant than the sort of refrigerator cool box idea that we saw in the EV6 that we drove recently. I quite like this, and of course you got your wiper fluid here as well. Here on the side of the EV3, that design continues. I quite like this sort of two-tone color scheme with black here around the wheels, the black down here, black mirrors, and then the light color, black again, light color, black again. It's quite nice. It's well done. It's well judged, I think, as well. And it makes the whole car looks boxy and muscular at the same time. So good in terms of design. We got 19-inch wheel rim combination on this version. This is the GT Plus line. So there's some other versions and also rim designs available. Here in the front we also find the charging port. It's still a little bit of a journey for EV makers to find out where the best solution is for the charging location. We had it front center for a while, though that didn't really work. Personally, I don't like it in the front either, because I prefer to back into spots rather than nose first. So for me, it's nicer to have the charging spot where the fuel filler cap used to be. But okay, it's over here. We have 11 kilowatt charging at home, obviously, and we have 130 kilowatts of fast charging. Not really groundbreaking and a little bit on the slow side, especially if you compare it to Volkswagen, for example, with the ID models. They go much faster. But that said, this has an 81 kilowatt hour battery. So according to the WLTP, it's about 540 kilometers, which means real world a little bit over 400. So you got plenty of range with this car, which is quite nice. And in about half an hour, a little more, you'll be charging from 10 to 80%. So not groundbreaking, but not unlivable either. And that's mainly because this car is on the 400 volt architecture and not the 800 volt that the bigger Kia models have. Here in the back of the Kia EV3, there's a lot of design going on again, but it is a relatively clean rear. I quite like it. It's nice and chunky, nice and big, and especially obviously these light signatures have to remind you of the same light signature on the front, and that is part of the whole Kia EV family look. The blinkers are down here. And that's really all there is in terms of design elements. I quite like the fact that it's light, dark again. And overall, nice and clean, like I already said, well done. The rear window is not all too big. It's only about this high. So the rearward visibility, as you'll see later on the inside, is not the best. There's a backup camera, of course. And there is a wiper integrated here behind the brake light into this little bit of spoiler. So it's a very elegant solution, very nicely done by Kia, because they haven't made the mistake of saying like, oh, you don't need a wiper and it'll all blow off over here. You don't need that. That's just not true in the real world. So this is elegant, it's out of the way, it doesn't break, it's not messing with aerodynamics or anything, and you still have the option to wipe your rear glass. Well done. Opening up the boot, so this is the rear view camera, and the boot opening is down here. According to Kia, we have 460 liters, but it looks a lot smaller to me. Obviously, I haven't measured it or anything, but this is what you get. I left the charging cable in there for scale, and as you can see, it's quite featureless. It's just a rectangle. What is nice, for example, we saw in the EV6, there was quite a sloping rear, and you lose a lot of volume that way. Here, it's quite high ending, so you always have space for larger items, which is quite nice. No hooks or tie-down points or anything to see, but there is a double floor. with quite a lot of extra space here. There's some styrofoam in here for your tow bar and your tire pressure kit and so on, and about this much extra volume. So that's probably how they got the 460 liters. But with the floor in place like this, you have no load lip to lift over. So that is quite nice as well. Here in the front of the Kia EV3, there is a lot of recognizable Kia equipment. So if you've seen any of our previous Kia videos, you're gonna see a lot of the same stuff, which is great because most of it works really well. And Kia has also not made the mistake of finding solutions here for problems that didn't exist in the first place. So everything is quite logical, and it's very much you can get in here and you feel familiar with the cabin almost instantly. I'll take you around the car, obviously starting at the left as usual with some traditional buttons for your windows and mirrors. I get some comments sometimes saying like, why do you point that out? Obviously those buttons can be anywhere, and especially the mirrors, like who cares where the mirror control button is? Well, I do because, you know, when you're by yourself in the car all the time, fine, you don't need to adjust your mirrors that often. But when you're wearing a thick jacket, or when there's somebody sitting in the back, or, you know, when you want to make small adjustments, it's nice that it's always accessible instantly, and you can also operate it while sitting in your driving position. Because it's just easier that way, and you can make quick adjustments. So good that it's over here. Up here next to the door handle, we also have some buttons for the seat heating, ventilation and steering wheel heating in this version. So that's quite nice. Those are easy to control, especially now in wintertime. You want to have those within reach at all times. On my left, I have the parking button, the boot release button, the frunk release button, and a traction control off button. You're never going to use that, trust me. But, you know, those are fine. They're there. You don't need those all the time, and they're within reach, so that's good. The steering wheel is very traditional Kia, so we got two button clusters on the spokes, and we have the drive mode button on the bottom spoke. A nice position, you know, you don't need to dig in menus or anything or find it somewhere underneath. You know, when you're driving and you want to change modes, you have your hands on the wheel anyway. Easy solution. Awesome. The other two button clusters, obviously for your systems, for your media control and so on, and for your cruise control, which works just fine. There's a quick access button here as well that I have mapped to my driver aid systems, especially the speed warning one, to turn that off quickly, so that is also a good solution. Behind the steering wheel, there's two paddles for your regen braking, right one to reduce, left one to add. For me, I always turn it off completely because I like to roll. But if you want more regen braking, you can do that with the left pedal, and you can even adjust it corner to corner. But in my experience, you do that for a day and then you're done playing and you just leave it in your preferred mode. But if you want to, you can make that into a whole game. Behind that, we have traditional stocks for the indicators and the wipers. And then there is this sort of chunky unit sticking out of the steering column for the drive select. Not really sure what Kia was thinking there. It looks like a bit of an afterthought. In all fairness, it is functional. You know, when you're turning for parking, for example, and you have to go back and forward a few times, it is nicely within reach, but it looks hideous. That's not a good design solution here. It looks a bit like, oh, we forgot the drive select. Let's just chunk this in here and all as well. But okay, it's there and it works, and there's also the start-stop button is on there as well. It does get a bit busy, especially here on the right side, because we have the button cluster here on the right. We have the flipper behind the wheel. Then we have the wiper stalk over here, and then the drive select stalk underneath that. So there's a lot going on right here within sort of one palm space of the car. So that is something that maybe needs to be sort of sorted out a little bit better. And I really think if this chunky gear thing wasn't here, then it would be much nicer already. Then we have a selection of 3 screens. Driver screen first, that is your standard Kia driver screen, which works fine as far as I'm concerned. The information is clear. There's not too much going on, so it doesn't get too busy. And in conjunction with the head-up display in this version, you can set it up in such a way that you use the head-up display most of the time and just glance at the driver display every once in a while. Next to that, we have a little screen for everything temperature and air conditioning related. I don't like that, to be honest, because if I'm sitting here as the driver, it's already blocked by the steering wheel, so that's not ideal. And it's not handy to have to adjust your ventilation and so on in here, because it's not haptic feedback or anything. So, you know, when you want to adjust things, you have to look at it 2 or 3 times in order to make sure it has done what you want it to do. It's not handy, and it doesn't really add anything to the equation. I can enlarge it to display itself on the main screen, but then obviously you're blocking other things. And the weird part is Kia has also put physical buttons underneath the main screen for temperature control and fan speed control and fan speed modes. So I'm not really sure what this button is, what this little screen is adding, because I think do either one or the other, preferably the physical one. because they can just add a few buttons here and then all is well, you can do everything manual. And if that isn't possible, the Sorento and the EV6 that we drove in earlier videos had a whole unit here with a touchscreen for the Climatronics and everything, which wasn't ideal either, but at least it was a single solution rather than a double sort of halfway solution like we have now. That said, it is great to have physical buttons for temperature adjustment and speed adjustment, because that's just easy, and that's the same thing as the mirrors. It's things you want to adjust a little bit on the go, like, ooh, a little bit more air, a little bit warmer, a little bit colder. It's nice to have a button here that does exactly what you think it does and doesn't require you to look at it once or twice in order to get your action done. So this is good, I like that. The main screen itself works great too. I quite like the Kia software in general. The menu structure is not too complicated, although sometimes you have to dig a little deeper than you think. Nothing going wrong here, and obviously when you own this car, you're going to set this up exactly the way you want it to be. Underneath there's a bunch of haptic feedback buttons for home, map, search, media, star and setup. So those are shortcuts to go to those pages in the menu directly. Not 100% sure if that's necessary, because if you set this up with the tiles in such a way that you want it to be, you'll get there quickly anyway, but okay, it's nice that they're there, and they have a little vibration behind it so you know for sure that you touched it. We got some manual ventilation direction control, manual volume button here as well, and your alarm lights, so that works too. And then underneath that we have a huge sort of void with some charging options all the way down into the dash, so that's great. We got some inductive charging down here as well, but because there's no transmission tunnel, obviously we have a lot of space here, and the Kia has left this completely open. So means there's a lot of space for me to move my knees, which is great. And this is also space where you can put a backpack or a purse or something. You can just chuck it in here when you're by yourself in the car, and it just works. The central armrest is a bit tricky because this opens into nothing, so I'm not really sure why that opens. And then this front bit slides forward to create sort of a cutting board, not like maybe for lunch or something. I don't know, not really sure what this is supposed to do, but it is what it is, I suppose. I can close this back up, and then there's 4 buttons here: auto hold, cameras, parking sensors and hill descent control. Not really sure why you need hill descent in this car, but okay. These buttons, I would have preferred to have them on the dash, because it's not like you accidentally press them, but I'm not really sure why they need to be over here. Then there's the panoramic roof in this version. It's a necessity because it lets in a lot of light, which is great. The only downside is that it's only halfway, so it doesn't go all the way to the back, making the back quite dark, as we'll see in a bit. The rear view mirror is standard normal mirror, so I can see behind, no issues whatsoever, even though the rear window is not too big. But if you have passengers in the back, you won't see anything, and there is no digital version in this one at least. And I'm not sure why, because Kia has a digital mirror in the EV9, for example, and it works great, but like in the Sorento, for example, they didn't have it, and it's the same in this one. So I'm not sure why Kia has done away with the digital option. Maybe it's too expensive, or maybe camera placement or something, but it would have been a nice to have for this car as well. The seats are quite comfy too. It's all vegan friendly for the people that are into that, so that's good too. And these are heated and cooled, like I said, in this GT Plus version. So that's nice too. I'm quite comfortable. I fit in them relatively easy with my 1.83 m and 90 kilos. So yeah, all is well there too. And I'd say all is well with the cabin in general. There's a lot to see and a lot to do, but it doesn't get busy at any point, and I have a good overview out and sideways, so it's a pleasant place to be as a driver, easy to get comfortable, and overall a good place to be also for longer journeys, which you will be doing with your big battery in this version at least. Obviously we got to do a little drive in this Kia EV3, but we have to start by turning off the safety systems. There is a fast key on the steering wheel for the lane departure system. Got to keep that pressed 3 seconds and then that's off. Sign on the dash, good. You also want to turn off the speed warning. Now you could do that by long pressing the volume button, and then the sound warning is off, but there's still a warning on your display. So I want that off completely. Luckily there's a shortcut button on the wheel that I have mapped to the ADAS system. So if I press that, it goes straight to that menu. Here are all your systems, and the speed warning is this one, and then turning it off. So that's great, nice and quick. It needs to be done, EU rules, but this is actually quite simple, so not too bad. Something you have to do every journey though. So we just left my residential area and we are now on the highway in this Kia EV3, which is a good place to start because the car feels quite at home here. It's comfortable in here, it's relatively quiet. We're doing 103 kilometers an hour now, so Dutch highway speeds, and it's a pleasant and relaxing place to be. Despite the fact that it's relatively dark in the back, I have great visibility out. I got light coming in from all directions. I have a nice head-up display with all the information and my navigation. All is well, actually. It's a nice place to be for me as the driver. I got good overview backwards as well. All is good. Now the size of the car is well judged because it's not a tiny car. We drove the Kia Picanto a couple of months ago, and that makes you feel small in traffic at all times, especially on the highway with big trucks, for example. And the Kia EV9 that we drove recently as well basically feels like a tank because it's such a large vehicle. You're taking up a lot of space on the road, and that's a whole different experience. But this one, being in the middle, really feels like the middle ground is best here. Because you don't feel small in any situation, so that's great, but you also don't feel sort of big and a bit cumbersome at the same time either. So that's good, because it's a vehicle that gives you enough space to transport people and things, but doesn't become a burden in terms of its size that you're like, ooh, maneuvering is tricky at all times. Not just on the highway, but especially obviously when the spaces get a bit smaller in a city, or even worse in a parking structure. And it makes sense because obviously this car aims at a space with, for example, the Skoda Enyaq or the Elroq, maybe the Volkswagen ID4, those kind of cars. And those are similarly sized as well and offer a very similar proposition. To take those cars off right away, by the way, I think it's really cool that in this sized vehicle space, there's quite a lot to choose, and a lot of cars have a very defined character of their own. So Skoda Enyaq is a very characterful car in its own right. The same thing goes for an ID4, and this Kia EV3 really fits that bill as well. It's a very own Kia philosophy in here and also on the outside, and the design language and the way you interact with the car. It's very unique, and I think that's cool that you really have something that you can pick in this space. And I can really imagine that for all those cars actually, that it's a love or hate kind of thing maybe, that you look at an Enyaq and you're like, oh no, that's absolutely not for me. The Volkswagen ID4 is way more my kind of thing. And the same goes for this Kia. I can really see that you really like this design and the futuristic lights and the family feel of the EV line. But at the same time, I can also totally see that you don't like this at all. Now, in the interior tour, I already mentioned how easy it is to get familiar with this car. And that's really evident when you're here on the highway. Personally, I drive about 3 or 4 different cars every single week. So it takes me some time to sort of reset and get familiar with the car. This is a car where you can get in and you look around once or twice and you're like, all right, I figured it out. It's quite easy to get familiar with this car, which is nice because it's important that you feel at home in the car. And this car being so airy here in the front with all the space here in the middle, for example, the logical button layout, the software that is relatively friendly, it's a good car to get familiar with. It's not a complicated thing to figure out. And of course, there's always small nuances and small, like tiny things in the car that you have to find as you live with the car. But you know, the first 85–90% of dealing with a car is pretty easy, and you can get that done in the first 10 minutes that you're here. Getting into the back of the EV3, the door handle is over here. So that's not in the door itself, but it's back here. And opening this up, you can see there's plenty of space for me to get in like this behind myself. Now, I often get people in the comments going, it's not relevant to see if you can sit behind yourself. But I am Dutch, we live in the Netherlands, and we are tall people. So the average teenager is my size. So I don't think it's a non-relevant test to see if I can sit here, because in your average family with teenagers, where this car would certainly fit, you're going to have to deal with tall people. And owning this car, obviously, it's not out of the question either that you'll have to transport some adults every once in a while. Now, sitting here in the back, you can immediately see how dark it gets, especially the shadow for my head. That's obviously because the panoramic roof in the front does not extend here to the rear. So it does get a bit dark in here. The windows also don't help because they're not that big. So that is a thing that you need to consider if you're going to be transporting children, especially small children back here. The seats are not huge, but they have this sort of coat rack in it that you can obviously hang your jacket or a suit jacket on, which is very handy, but it's always there. So that's a bit in the way. And also the headrests are quite, I wouldn't say massive, but they have this net thing in the front, and there's 2 elements to it. It's a bit, you have to work with it a bit as a kid to sort of look around and keep that connection with the front of the car. There is a lot of light and information coming from the front, especially this middle gap is quite large, so that is nice, that really helps. But it is something that you, if you're going to buy this car, probably have to try out with your children to see if that is not an issue. Around back here, the materials are great, basically the same as in the front, so that's nice. We got USB power in the front seats for charging, so that's also good. We have some ventilation control here in the middle, but no temperature or fan speed adjustment, so that is just direction adjustment. And there's a bit of a bin underneath, and there's also seat heating in this version on the outer seats. I'll sit in the middle for you. You can see that it's basically the same height as the outer seats, so I'm almost touching the roof. I'd say if you're taller than 185, you're not going to fit here, but I'm 183, so for me it's okay. Also here in the middle for a shorter journey, not an issue, because the middle seat is actually quite soft, so that is nice. Finally, I'll show you the armrest. Standard Kia armrest, nothing going wrong here, except the fact that the cup holders are permanently exposed, so you're always in there with your hand or your wrist, which is not ideal. Now this car has a little over 200 horsepower, so just to give you an example, we're now doing 98. If I floor it, 110, 20, 30, 40, and we have to brake. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the power available in this car. Naturally, with this kind of power and this size and weight car, you're not going to break any speed records, especially not in acceleration above 100 kilometers an hour. This car feels much faster than it is under 100, so let's say from 50 to 100, it's very zippy. And driving in town, obviously when the speeds are under 50, it's more than adequate. It's very pleasant. It's a good amount of power to feel quick without overwhelmingly like, oh, whoa, we're going way too fast. None of that is happening. So it's a pleasant way to move through traffic, especially at lower speed. But also here on the highway, you don't feel out of place at all. If you take this car to Germany, obviously, you run into its limitations quite quickly. But I don't think that is why you would buy this car. Now, something I noticed on low speed, especially when the road surface is not ideal, like in my street, for example, there was some construction, so there's quite a lot of loose sand on the road. The tires do break traction a bit too often for my taste. I think that has a lot to do with the tire choice, because I'm suspecting it's some kind of eco-friendly tire that gives you a bit more range, and those are notoriously less grippy than regular tires. So especially when there's a little bit of steering lock and you give it a bit of gas, then you feel the tires like jump a little bit. So that is not ideal. And especially not because it's not like I'm flooring the car in my residential area, for example. So it's a bit annoying sometimes that it does that. And you don't even have to go to sport mode or anything for that. If you push the car a little bit in longer corners, so let's say at medium speed, you also notice, again, I think it has more to do with the tires than with the car, that it's understeer, 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 lack of grip. So it's also not ideal, and I fully appreciate the fact that you're not driving 1010s through your residential neighborhood, obviously. But if I try this out on some industrial estates, for example, to see what the car does when it's provoked a little bit, it does notice. And I think obviously that is mainly a safety feature, because most car makers dial in understeer into their setup to make the car safer, because obviously you don't want the back to come around when you do some. This is a safety feature too, by the way. There is a lot of sensors making sure I don't fall asleep, and because I look at you guys every once in a while, the car thinks I'm distracted and tells me to take a break. That's a theme in general, actually. The car is very much on the safe side, also with blind spots and collision warnings and those kind of things. It's constantly notifying you that there's a lot of stuff happening around you. Luckily, you can turn most of that off. But for these test cars, I usually leave it on to get familiar with the systems and to get an impression on how a particular car brand handles that. But back to my previous point, so there's a bit of understeer in the car for safety reasons, I assume, and I think that will probably also be cured with less eco-friendly tires. Because all around the car, has the weight down low, so that's great. So that should in theory be good for cornering, but that said, in all honesty, you're not going to do any crazy cornering with this car. The same reason you're not going to use the sport mode or anything. It just doesn't really add anything. It doesn't have enough power to justify a sport mode, I think. So you're probably never going to touch that. Like I say in most of these reviews, I'm not sure why manufacturers do that anyway. Putting a sport mode, like who is going to sit here and go like, yes, now it's time for sport mode. I'm going to attack my driving road back to the office. Like, I don't really see the point of that. If you put 500 horsepower in a car, sure, put a sport mode in it, but for this kind of car, who cares, right? I would probably always go for the bigger battery though. There's always the argument that you don't need a big battery here in the Netherlands, especially because the charging infrastructure here is so good. But it's just nicer to not have to charge as often. Especially when you don't have a charger at home and you rely on public charging. You know, the longer you can go between charges, the better, I'd say. So as far as that goes, I can understand that you go for the bigger battery to get that extra bit of range. And it's just also nicer because, you know, it's now a 5-degree morning in February, and you just lose a lot of range with temperature and with weather. So it's always nice to have that little bit extra in reserve. Only two things to complain about. First one is the lack of light in the back. That could have been done a bit better. And this third Klima screen here doesn't really add anything for me. I think the solutions in the Sorento and the EV6 were better. And in this, they could have just solved it with more physical buttons down here instead of putting that little extra screen. It's not functional, it's a bit cumbersome, it doesn't really add anything, and it's in the wrong spot. So for me, that is the only design mistake in here. That's all I got for you in this video. Thank you very much for watching. Give it a thumbs up if you liked the video, and a sub to the channel is always appreciated, of course. And until then, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Cheers!